Cryle General Hospital was a city unto itself. The nurses, the doctors, of course, lived on base. You had hundreds of civilian employees that lived off base. You had a swimming pool, you had a complete recreational area, a theater, a library. The Cleveland Public Library brought out books. The Cleveland Press, under the leadership of Louis B. Seltzer, made sure that every GI had his own radio, because the hospital had its own radio station. So every GI had what today we would call almost a headset, 3 stations, the radio station at the hospital, and then it would pick up 2 other stations from Cleveland. So the community really took Cryle and its patients into its heart, into its family, so to speak.
Colonel Hardin wanted everybody to get out on the weekends, have a good time. He's saying, you go into Cleveland and you didn't have to carry any money with you, because if you started out with $2, you were going to come back with $2. Some guy said to me one time, he was new to Cleveland area, new to Cryle, he said, well, do you know, he said, you live here, he said, tell me some of the cheap beer joints, he said, because where you can get 10-cent beer and stuff like that. I said, you don't do it that way. You got $2, you go into the best bar in town, you go down to Euclid Avenue, Playhouse Square, go to the best bar in town, put the $2 on the bar and say, that's it, I might as well shoot this $2. Give me one of that top shelf whiskey. You're gonna go out of there drunk and you're gonna have $2 in your pocket.
Cryle's specialty was orthopedic surgery, burns, and later neuropsychiatric.
It was in the fall, I know it's shortly before Christmas, and I had to have some nerve, I had what they call a radial nerve parallelism, and where you have a dropped wrist, and they had saved the arm. They gave me bone grafts and everything else. They had about 48 operations while I was there, maybe more. But I couldn't move my fingers or anything. So they sent me down to Nichols Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, which was similar to Cryle, but not as pretty as Cryle.
Early on, before I did anesthesia there, I worked on the wards when it was necessary, and I became friends with this boy. And he used to save his mail for me to read to him and ask me to write to his girlfriend. And and then I did not see him because I moved to surgery, but I would go to see him every day, and they came and got me in the middle of the night he died, because he was asking for me. And I wrote a letter to his parents, which is not permitted in the Army, and I knew that, but I wrote the letter and gave it to our commanding officer, and he sent it to them after they had been officially notified that their son had died. And I just never forgot that boy.
When, at last, VE Day in May and then VJ Day in September 1945, the guns were silent and everybody's, of course, desperate to get home, what do you do with all of these hospitals? I mean, they were tremendously important while the casualty figures are continuing to mount. So the war is over in 1945. What now? Many of the general hospitals were closed. Cryle, however, was designated in June of 1946 to the new Veterans Affairs or Veterans Administration Division. So in 1946, Cryle General became Cryle VA Hospital. The mission of Cryle VA in 1946 was slightly altered. It involved much more teaching, a reduced patient population, an expanded role for women, minorities, and patient services. And from that point on, Cryle VA and the rest of the VA hospitals continued to do their service, because the wounds of World War II, of course, would continue literally in many cases for years, long after 1945.
I knew we were going to move to Cleveland. And I wrote to VA Hospital in Cleveland asking for an interview. My first tour of duty was on spinal cord injury, and we had 40 patients. The nurses were very receptive. Yeah, I was just one of them, as usual, because I think nurses have a special bond. My head nurse was Jean Hickey. And so I didn't have any untoward effects. It was just another job that I enjoyed. I liked nursing, so it was not difficult for me.
Almost as suddenly, but not as shocking as Pearl Harbor, we heard in June of 1950 that North Korea has crossed the 38th parallel and attacked South Korea. I'm not sure how many Americans knew where Korea was, but certainly phrases like the 38th parallel and all of the other associations with the Korean War began to really dominate our news in the summer of 1950. So here again, Cryle VA will become a serviceable hospital as more and more GIs are returning from the Korean War, in which over 50,000 died, and thousands, of course, sustaining wounds that needed treatment, and in this case, back at Cryle VA.
It was the beginning of the evacuation from the fields. During World War II, we developed close air support where you could help the troops on it. Now this was the other part. The helicopters came aboard, where a person could be transferred to a helicopter, airlifted to a field hospital or to a Navy hospital ship and be treated. This was a great savings for those who had. Later on, we had the opportunity to have airstrips where we could fly people out, and that made a big difference. I would say that a great number of people were wounded, but because of the improved supply, people survived. Think people that would normally die because they couldn't be treated fast enough.
Cryle is a hospital treating patients, but there's another dimension that I think we tend to miss. There are families, mothers, fathers, parents, children, doctors, nurses, living as best they can as a family on the base, both during World War II and during the 1950s when it was a VA hospital.
Well, I don't think I really have an earliest recollection. That year at Cryle just sort of all blends together. But I recall it being extremely pleasant. From an adult's point of view, I think I grew up with the facilities of a health spa. I don't think back in the early 50s many kids had the opportunity to have swimming pool available to them and a gymnasium available. As I recall, the hospital was surrounded by a very, very large wooded area. I remember as a kid believing, I think there was a drainage ditch that ran across the place that at the time I thought was probably a wonderful trout stream. So it was just a very, very pleasant time.